Hello, this is Roy Blight. Today we're into the book of Acts and are going through the Bible series here. We want to understand all that we can about the book of Acts, and we want in particular to find out all the details that make it up. And when we look at the details that make up the book of Acts, realize that it was given to us by Luke. So today, as we look at Acts, we want to look at, in particular, who was Luke and what was his contribution and so forth into the narrative that he put down. It was a very lengthy narrative. Remember, Luke was the author. Actually, the author was God, but the Lord used him to pen the book of Luke and also in the book of Acts, as we see. So as we go through the scriptures, we're at a very pivotal time. We started out with going through the four gospels themselves. And now as we go into the book of Luke, we're getting into the history of the early church. We're getting into the history of the early believers, and who all had a relationship or had a view or had a very close proximity to Yeshua the Messiah while he was on planet Earth. So today we want to ask the question, so who is or was Luke? Now, Luke, the physician, is also known as Luke the Evangelist because he was evangelizing while he was putting together the book of Luke. He's, again, as I mentioned, he's the author of both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Now, he wrote more of the New Covenant than anyone else, even the Apostle Paul. When you put together how large the book of Luke is, and you put together how large the book of Acts is, the evangelist Luke, the physician Luke, actually wrote more than even Paul did when you put together all of Paul's writings. Now, Luke was not an eyewitness to Yeshua's ministry, but he lived during the first century, and according to his own writings, he carefully investigated everything from the beginning, and he did it in great detail. As a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, Luke likely had a direct access to the apostles and other accounts of Yeshua's life and ministry, such as the Gospel of Mark. And he probably knew the main characters that we see in the book of Acts and so forth. He probably talked to them, was their acquaintance and so forth. While he presumably was educated as a physician, Luke is celebrated as one of the faith's earliest historians. That's where we know him from, not so much for his medical work, but for his historical work as a historian. His methodical and detailed writings give us the only thorough record of what happened after Yeshua ascended to heaven in the book of Acts. So what he did was very important, though he was a physician. And we see that what he did, though, was he put this amazing account together. Without Luke's account in Acts, it would be hard to imagine how the body of Messiah grew from a small, fragile movement within Judaism to what would eventually become the greatest expression of Israel's Messiah in the world. And he was right in the middle of all of it, giving us the most detailed description of what was going on that we have, even to this day. Some quick facts here concerning Luke. Now, most of what we know about Luke comes from his own writing, so keep that in mind. And a handful of mentions in Paul's letters about Luke also tells us a little bit about him, not too much. Some details of his life are ambiguous, and scholars debate what can really be gathered from the limited evidence we have. So when you study Luke, you study what he said basically about himself. There's not a lot else. And from the book of Acts and Paul's writings, we know that Luke was one of Paul's companions. So keep that in mind. In Acts 16:10, Luke suddenly inserts himself into the narrative. You don't really hear of him before, including himself among Paul's companions. So he just kind of slips into the narrative right there. And he's one of the companions helping take care of the Apostle Paul along his journey. In the book of Colossians, or the letter that Paul wrote to the Colossians, Paul refers to a man named Luke as a dear friend. And Philemon, Paul refers to a man named Luke as one of my fellow workers. In 2 Timothy, Paul says, only Luke is with me. So you see his presence was very constant and was very thorough, even as Paul is writing his letters. Paul mentions Luke in passing in Colossians 4:14, but from that mention, we learn that he was a doctor. I see it says, our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send their greetings. So we know that he was a doctor just from that. Now, an early prologue to the Gospel of Luke, and this is possibly as early as the 2nd century, also records that Luke was born in Antioch and by profession was a physician. He had become a disciple of the Apostle Paul and later followed Paul until Paul's martyrdom in Rome. He died at the age of 84 years, and this is from the Anti-Marcionite prologue to the Gospel of Luke. So that's from an ancient writing. We get that information about him dying when he was 84. But boy, what a full life he lived. In his own writings, Luke often uses common medical terminology to describe illnesses and afflictions. You'll have no problem thinking that he's a physician, a doctor by his own writings, because he's very thorough. In Luke 14:2, Yeshua encountered a man with dropsy, or abnormal swelling of his body. And Luke used the word hudropikos, and it's a Greek word. It's a common term in Greek medical literature that was found nowhere else in the scripture, but this is what Luke used. Luke's precise terminology draws from his experience as a physician and sets him apart from the other biblical authors. I compare him actually to Matthew, because Matthew was also, as an accountant, as a money man, he was very thorough and very detailed in his explanation of things, as was Luke. Now, Luke's title, the Evangelist, comes from the fact that he wrote one of the 4 Gospels. And theologians throughout history have referred to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as evangelists, because how more evangelical can you get than writing one of the 4 Gospels? So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are regarded as the 4 evangelists because their writings proclaim the good news or the gospel of Yeshua, the Messiah. Now, many argue that Luke was a Gentile, the only Gentile author of the New Covenant, indeed of the Bible. And this idea comes from Colossians 4:11-14, where Paul separates Luke from the only ones of the circumcision group, which some scholars interpret as the only Jews. So it says that where Paul separates Luke from the circumcision group. So perhaps he wasn't Jewish, but there's not a lot much else that you can go by. While Luke likely was from Troas or Antioch, that does not mean he could not have been a Jew, however. It's entirely possible that Luke was a Hellenic Jew, biologically Jewish, but culturally he was Greek. So this very well could have been the case. Hellenic Jews adopted the customs of Greek culture and did not follow all the Jewish practices such as circumcision. So you see, they're in the modern day Greek culture of that time. And Luke never spoke in the first person in the Gospel of Luke. So we see that this is how he wrote it. Now, while Luke was not an eyewitness to Yeshua's ministry, he did have access to some who were, including the Gospel of Mark, which Mark was believed to be Peter's account handed down to John Mark, who wrote it all down. Luke's Gospel and Acts comprise a whopping 27.5% of the New Covenant. That's more than anyone else, again, including the Apostle Paul. And that's an astounding fact to me because of all the letters that Paul wrote. But no, Luke, the content, the overall compilation of all of his data is amazing when you take in the account of his writing in Luke and in the book of Acts. So a lot of people will ask when you study the book of Luke and the book of Acts, they want to know, who was this most excellent Theophilus? Because both the book of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, both of them are addressed to this Theophilus. So let's look at this a little bit. Theophilus is mentioned twice in the Bible, both times in books written by Luke and Acts. There are several theories as to who Luke might have been referring to. Theophilus was most likely a person of influence, as the term most excellent was reserved for someone of great social standing. So when he says most excellent, that means something. Most excellent was used just 2 other times in the New Covenant, and both of those were in cases referring to governors, political governors, specifically to Roman governors. So he just didn't throw words like that around. Theophilus may have been a Roman official who either had become a believer in Yeshua, the Messiah, or was interested in learning more about the faith. We don't know, could have been. Luke's attention to the Gentiles who came to believe in Yeshua in the book of Acts would seem to back this theory. Now, in Luke's time, to create a book the size of the Gospel of Luke would have involved considerable expense. Somebody would have had to foot the bill to do all the traveling and so forth. When you also consider that Luke did a great deal of traveling around to interview eyewitnesses and people who had a relationship with the Lord during his ministry, the cost of producing this work can only be imagined. So you can see that it costs a lot of money for Luke to do what he did, because he went everywhere getting this information. Many people think that Theophilus was a wealthy patron who paid Luke's expenses or commissioned him to create the writings that would one day become the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. This very well could have been the case. Some also think that Luke's writings were addressed to Paul's lawyer during the time of his trial. Well, certainly a lawyer would have benefited from the thorough research books that Luke produced. However, based upon what we can gather from other writings at the time, it's not likely that a lawyer would have been addressed as most excellent like a Roman governor. Now, they were pretty well looked upon like lawyers are looked upon today. The name Theophilus means friend of God. So it is entirely possible that Luke was writing to all of us who love the Lord rather than just to one person. This conceivably could have been the case. Now, although the use of most excellent would point towards a single specific person, it is clear that Luke meant his books to be read not just by Theophilus, but by many. You can only imagine. So this was who Luke is and who Theophilus was as well. And as we look at it, we see that Luke acknowledged Theophilus as he began his writing the Acts of the Apostles. That's the official name of the book of Acts. His comprehensive writing of the life and ministry of Yeshua, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, is contained in the book of Luke. And all of the wonderful things that Yeshua did, including his life, death, burial, and resurrection, are all contained in the Gospel of Luke. Now, Acts begins with Yeshua already having returned to his disciples. He's resurrected from the dead, and he's returning to his disciples. And this is where the book of Acts begins. During the time of the counting of the Omer is when this happened. That's the 50 days between the Feast of First Fruits and the Feast of Pentecost. The 50 days between First Fruits and Shavuot or Pentecost, the Lord appeared actually at various times to many of his people. The disciples, who are now referred to as apostles, the sent ones or ambassadors in Greek, received numerous instructions from the Lord during this time. He said, when he first, during the time of the Omer, he told them, don't leave Jerusalem. Wait for the promise of the Father. Now, many great things are promised them, and the Lord would be with them. So we realize that the Lord told them, do not leave Jerusalem. And then one day, while at the Mount of Olives, Yeshua told his apostles that they would be witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So they knew that God had something big planned for them, and they didn't know exactly how it was going to happen, but the Lord said, don't leave Jerusalem, because the Father had a gift for him. And we know that from today, because actually, if you're a follower of the Lord today, that same gift is restored or reserved for you. So at this point, as Yeshua was talking to the apostles, he ascended into heaven. He was standing among them, and he went straight up into heaven. And Yeshua was lifted up into the air in the midst of the apostles, and a cloud then took him away. It's called the Ascension. As his men gazed up into the sky, 2 men dressed in white robes came alongside him. And these men told the apostles, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? The same Yeshua who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven." And then after that, the apostles headed back to Jerusalem to await the promise of the Father. So this is all done during the 50 days of counting the Omer. Actually, it was day 40 when this happened. Now, staying in an upper room in the city of Jerusalem were Peter, James, John and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. In addition to these, there were also some women who stayed with them, Mary the mother of Yeshua, and some of Yeshua's brothers. They were all there. So during this time of the Ascension, we see that the Lord had finally left them, and the Lord had prepared them now to go into Jerusalem and to wait for the promise of the Father. And this is a very crucial time in the early beginnings of the church and the body of Messiah, because the Lord wants us to do the same thing, to wait upon him and to do what he tells us to do. And if we are obedient to do that, we find that great things will happen in our lives, and he'll communicate his will to our lives. And he desires to be intimate with us and to know us. Yeshua, the bottom line is Yeshua is alive. And that means everything to where we are today, even because living through the days we're living in right now, preparing ourselves for the coming days ahead, your relationship with the Messiah is the forefront of your Christian or Messianic experience. And it's at the forefront of really who you are in the Lord. It's not by how good you're trying to be, it's by how much do you know the Lord. And because the Lord knows you, and he wants you to have a good, intimate relationship with him. So we'll pick this theme back up tomorrow as we study the book of Acts. Hit the like button, subscribe to the station. God bless you. Have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.